Welcome to the Hey Chaplain podcast. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. Hey Chaplain is an officer wellness podcast produced for cops and covers topics like your career, your wellness, and law enforcement culture. On Hey Chaplain, you'll hear from dispatchers and federal agents, sheriffs, and U.S. Marshals, as well as the occasional retired cop who's written his first book. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain share their hard-earned wisdom so that police officers everywhere can survive and thrive. So to be perfectly transparent, even though I was targeting exactly this content, I didn't really know what to do with this episode. In one sense, it's obviously a continuation of episode 60 with Mark Garrett from the California Highway Patrol, although the topic changes so dramatically from the previous interview with him that it's clearly a distinct interview. So, in another sense, it's really more like a continuation of episode 48. Do you remember that one with Rabbi Tzvi Levin? He was talking about his family history and the influence of his parents and the values that he has today. This interview does exactly the same thing, and there's a lot of similarities. So ultimately, I decided that this needed to be a bonus episode, and you're just going to have to go back and listen to both episodes 48 and 60 to get the whole complimentary picture. It's a story of parents who came up in hard times and imparted values and principles that are critically important today to law enforcement, our families, and our culture. And it's also a challenge to continue to pass on those values to the next generation. Here's Mark Garrett. Tell me about your parents and the influence that they had on you.
It's incalculable, the influence my parents had on me. And thanks for asking, because I love telling the story of my parents. My parents were born in 1921 and 1926, respectively, in Dallas, Texas. They both passed away. My dad was black, and my mom was mixed race. She was black, Cherokee Indian, and Caucasian. So they grew up in the Deep South during the Depression under Jim Crow. My parents are the people who rode in the back of the bus. So I got to hear history from the history makers. And it couldn't have been worse for people like my parents growing up. My mom was the child of a single mother. My father was the child of a single mother. His dad was a philanderer. He was out on the road. They were very close, but his dad wasn't in his daily life. And my father's mother was murdered when she was 37 years old.
Wow.
He was 12. My father had an older brother, just about a year older. They were back to back. But he was essentially on his own in 1933 or 1934. Dallas, Texas is a black kid. My dad started driving a truck at 12 years old in Dallas, Texas.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah,
Yes.
I knew. Yeah, I'd heard you say one time that he started working at like 12.
At 12.
Yeah.
And this is actually how I met my mom, because, the term icebox, which is almost gone, I don't hear it, but literally that's what it was. Yeah. It was a box that you put ice on top of, and it would keep the food inside cold. Well, he delivered ice to homes, and that's how he met my mom when he was 12 and she was 6.
Wow.
Because he delivered ice to his future mother-in-law.
Right.
And yeah. So, and then when it got so bad in the Deep South, he started hoboing.
I was going to ask about that too. Yes. Yeah. So he's jumping trains as a teenager, right?
13 or 14. It was when he started hopping trains, Southern Pacific, from Dallas, Texas to downtown Los Angeles, because there was more work opportunity here in Southern California for blacks and during the Depression than there was in Texas.
So he'd hop a train in Texas and go across the American Southwest to California to get work.
Correct.
Wow.
So he washed cars, he used car lots, he was a short order cook, he cleaned floors, and he sent a lot of his money back to his older brother in Texas to help him out.
Yeah. My grandparents were in that same generation, and my grandfather and his siblings and my grandmother's siblings, a lot of them left Kansas and migrated out to Colorado to dig potatoes or out to California to pick fruit. And would go out to the West Coast or some other part of the country, and then would come back and send money back, and they go back and forth, and they ended up kind of spread across the country that way because some of them would stay, put
Right.
down roots. Your dad's doing this, and he gets drafted.
He gets drafted World War II.
Does he get drafted at the beginning of the war? I'm trying to do the math at my
He got drafted at the beginning of the war.
Okay.
Obviously, we have December 7th, 41. He got drafted in January of 42.
Okay. Where does he serve during the war?
So my dad was one of the relatively few GIs who served both he served in North Africa. He served in Europe, and then he served in the South Pacific. So he served in both theaters of the war, which is fairly unusual.
What was his MLS, or what did he do?
He was in the Army Air Corps.
Okay.
There's no Air Force at the time, Army Air Corps. But he was, like most blacks in World War II, he was in a supportive role. So my dad was an ammunition truck driver. He drove ammo to the front lines to supply the GIs. But my dad landed in North Africa under George Patton. Patton was already there, but later on my dad landed in North Africa and served under George Patton. So my dad served there. Then he went under Patton into Sicily and then into Italy proper. Mm-hmm. And he was there when about the same time that D-Day was happening in the Channel. After Italy was secured, they shipped him up, through the Mediterranean, up the English Channel, and then he went into France and to Paris. I think he ended up in Belgium. I'm not positive about that, but I do know he went to Paris. After VE Day, he was put on a transport ship, and everybody thought they were going home. When they got out into the Atlantic, the announcement came across the ship that, hey, gentlemen, we're not going home. We're now going to invade Japan. And he said men actually committed suicide. They actually jumped ship and killed themselves because they'd heard the stories about Japanese fighting. Anyway, he ended up on the island of Tinian where the A-bomb was delivered. He was there when the A-bomb was delivered, and he was there until the fall of Japan and then came home to San Francisco. My parents were already married at that point. He got married when he was 21. She was 16. They raised 5 kids. I always say they raised 4 good ones and me. And he went to World War II. They moved to California later.
The math I was trying to do is how old your mom would have been at the beginning of the war. So they got married.
They got married when she was 16. She had my oldest sister when my mom was 17 years old.
Oh, wow.
So she was born when my dad was overseas.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. And so after the war, what kind of work did he find?
So my dad went to work for the W.W. Henry Company, which is and you can still see it. It's owned by another company now, but it's in blue cans. It says Henry on it, and it's roof coating. It's adhesives, and it's mastic for your roof. Mm-hmm. Incredibly successful company. And my dad started there just canning goop. That's what it was in a double car garage. The original Mr. Henry is who he worked for. The original Henry. He was a mixer. He mixed the stuff together and he put it in cans, and the company grew and grew. So my father, who was born poor, black, and pretty much abandoned at 12 years old in the Deep South during the Depression, he ended up being a plant manager for the W.W. Henry Company and worked there for 42 years.
Oh, wow.
Four of his 5 kids through college on that salary and owned 3 homes before he died and never made any excuses about what trials and tribulations life had thrown him. He didn't forget those. It wasn't that he wasn't bitter about some of the things that he'd gone through, but at the same time, he made no excuses. You either make the right decisions or you complain about it and wither away. Now, my mom was more of an historian than my dad was. In other words, she was more of the oral communicator when it came to the circumstances that they endured in Texas, things like that. So I really learned kind of more about my dad from my mom than from my dad. But when I would hear these stories from my mom and my dad, but to a lesser extent, And then I would juxtapose their circumstances to the way they carried themselves, the way they treated other people. He just talked in very simple terms. He was a very, very bright man with a very, very short education. And he would just talk about, Mark, you got a decision to make. You have to do X, Y, Z or not. And as I got older, like into my mid-teens or later teens, my dad would always say, look, Mark, here's what I would do. Here's what I would do. But you are a man and you have to decide for yourself. And it was those types of answers that really instilled in me the sense of self-responsibility, that is really up to me. I have to decide. I have to take responsibility for my decisions. So my dad he was consistent with that response. In other words, he would give me his heartfelt advice. Here's what I would do, but it could be right. It could be wrong. You have to make the final call. And the only person going to hold you accountable for that is you.
And he's giving you agency to make your own decision. He's not imposing it on you.
Yes, right. That's exactly right.
So you guys lived in Southern California?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in southeast Los Angeles, which is Watts. This is where the 1965 Watts.
That's where I was going. That's where I was going next. And so you would have been a young child during the Watts riots. What do you remember of it? What do you remember of your parents' reaction to it? What was the conversation in the home about that kind of a thing?
So I was 2 years old during the riots, so I don't have a personal recollection of the riots themselves. However, but during that time, that was during the birth of the Crips and the Bloods and other gangs, but namely the Crips and the Bloods. So I don't remember specifically the riots, but I certainly remember the aftermath. Yeah. And I remember my parents talking so much as this transformation was happening about what the riots have done to our community. It was a beautiful community where I grew up until the riots, and things went downhill rapidly. But the Crips, the Bloods, the rampant crime, I remember all that. And of course, my parents talked about the incidents in the riots so much, I almost felt like I was a part of it. I wasn't. I don't remember it.
Right.
But it was such an immediate recollection and a recurring storytelling about them. It's really instilled in me what happened during the riots.
What changed?
What changed was there are so many things going on, and we probably need 5 podcasts to really delve into so much.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. But the same time that the Watts riots had occurred, and then you have the birth of all these gangs, not just in Southern California, of course. This is across the country. Sure. These riots, Chicago, and they're all places. But at the same time, we saw the welfare state really growing rapidly, and with all types of government, federal assistance primarily aimed at blacks, which certainly in a moral sense was great intentions. Hey, blacks have been wronged in this country. We need to do something, blah, blah. So at the same time, you see MLK being assassinated. You have all of this turmoil happening, the riots across the country. And then you see this influx of financial support from the federal government and other programs, which unfortunately, Jared, resulted in an unintentional attack on the nuclear family, because the federal government start replacing fathers with checks.
Yeah, and it disincentivized marriage.
Completely. Yeah. So what happened was you have these gangs now that just by bad luck are coming to fruition the same time the federal government is imposing its will, so to speak, on the nuclear family without bad intentions, but intentions aren't worth anything. The results are the only thing that matter. And so this is when you actually start seeing gangs, street gangs, taking on a more prominent role in the lives of other young men rather than fathers.
Yeah, that's what gang officers always tell me, is that you can see as fathers disappear, gangs rise. because those young boys need attachment. They need someone to follow. They can be taken advantage of if they're not given direction. Someone will step in and give them direction. And so as fatherhood decreases, gang activity increases, is what I understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so I saw that, I witnessed that. Now, at 8, 9, 10 years old, could I really appreciate it? No, but I certainly saw it. Later on in life, I began to appreciate what I had witnessed. And, that continued into the 80s and 90s and really coming to kind of a crescendo, in the early 1990s with the murder rate in Los Angeles County off the hook. So that's what I remember from the Watts riots and the aftermath.
Yeah. But then you were there in 92 with the LA riots also.
I worked two of the 4 primary nights. I worked right down the street from where I grew up as a new officer of the Highway Patrol, escorting LA City Fire, LA County Fire, Washington State Fire Department, San Diego, Phoenix. We had fire departments from all over the region, and taking them 13, 14 hours, just back to back to back, the next fire, the next fire, the next fire, the next fire.
So primarily escort and protection?
That's what CHP did primarily. We had some other ancillary duties as well, perimeter control. Actually, CHP got in a number of firefights. Thank God no officer was killed. But our primary job was protection for the firefighters.
What was it like for you?
It was surreal. And it wasn't lost on me that, not even 20-something years earlier, about 30 years earlier, I had been 2 years old in the first Watts riots, and now I'm a police officer in the next Watts riots, so to speak, in just a couple of miles from where the first riots started. And ironically, both of those incidents tie back to CHP enforcement contacts. The 1965 Watts riots was a CHP traffic stop, and of course the Rodney King riots was out of a CHP pursuit and traffic stop.
Oh, I didn't remember that.
Rodney King was pursued by CHP. They got the freeway. CHP calls for LAPD to take over. LA School Police and LAPD get involved, and they're the ones that actually engaged in the use of force with Rodney King. But they were both of those riots. Genesis were CHP traffic stops.
Can you tell me how you feel to have lived through your city burning twice? I mean, that's happened twice in your life. That pretty landmark, historic riots. How does that make you feel?
Well, in short, it's sad. It's just sad. And I get into the next word, for lack of a stronger word, Jared, it's disappointing. And again, that doesn't begin to really explain. It's devastating that a community would, quite frankly, do this to themselves. The people in Bel Air or people in upstate New York or people in Vail, Colorado, they're not hurt by these riots. Yeah. But the people who need the infrastructure, who need law enforcement the most, who are burning their own city down, they're going to suffer the most from these types of incidents. Rodney King was a dark time in law enforcement, but when you compare it to what my parents went through, to what my parents saw, to the terrible injustices that they witnessed, and they didn't burn Dallas, Texas down. No blacks did. There were protests and there were legal protests and things like this, but they had enough sense. And by the way, they had enough class and self-restraint not to destroy their own community. So when I say disappointing, again, I apologize for not coming up with a better word, but that's one of the things that comes to mind when I see that. I think, my God, what lack of values have we instilled in young people that would cause them to destroy a place where they live?
If you have a breakdown of the family and you remove fathers from the home, that means that there's not values instilled like what you had instilled from your father. I was going to ask also, the early 90s, Rodney King, the OJ trial, it was not it was surely not an easy time to be a black cop in L.A.
No.
What was your experience? Did you have people? Did you have family or friends say anything to you? I mean, were they generally supportive of you? But what was your experience?
Of course, my family was 100% supportive.
Good.
And my friends. I didn't have any of my friends that were demeaning or derogatory about me being a cop. But where I did run into some very, very ugly individuals was out in the field. I said it back then, I'll say it today, even though I'm not a cop anymore, based on my experience, that the biggest detractors and biggest supporters I ever found were people in the black community.
So you saw both extremes in the same
Both
community.
extremes.
Yeah. Okay.
It was either I was Uncle Tom, sellout, and other words I will not use on your show, other terms that were, vile, or I would respond to a scene, I'd show up, or I even stop somebody, and they would say, "Young man, thank you. We need more black cops like you. We need more cops of any color in this neighborhood. We need help.
Yeah.
Thank you. Come up here." I mean, just cheerleaders. And then you go, your next stop, and you were Satan incarnate. And it was based in, from the detractors based on race, that you are a sellout, you are a problem, you don't love your race, you hate your race, and things like this. So, that's what it was like, especially, you're right, Jared, right after Rodney King for the next 2 or 3 years. Oh my goodness, it was really, really rough. Now, did it ever really ruffle my feathers? No. I've got very thick skin, and I always had the pin and the ticket book or the handcuffs. So at the end of the day, I was going to win the argument. But sometimes I was taken aback by the vile nature, the vile comments of some people, and thought, my goodness, I think you're losing the big picture here.
Last question. I've heard you speak before about wanting to return honor to the law enforcement profession, and that being something that you feel a passion about having this profession of being a police officer be valued in our culture, and for the officers themselves to value it. Where does that passion come from for you? Does that come from your parents? Does that come from your experience on the job? Where does that come from?
Well, it's certainly a combination. Most of us are to some extent products of our environment, and my environment was from two parents who had very strong wills and had very good, deep respect for the law. And when I say law, I'm going to go into your wheelhouse here. I'm talking about God's laws.
Yeah,
that's where all of this for me starts. So it talks, and then we, my wife and I talk to our son every day. We talk about, Dylan, who is more important than mom and dad? He knows God. Exactly. Who's important after God? Mom and dad. Exactly. God's always first. And so we tell him that. My parents told me the same thing to the day that they each, respectively passed away. So when I think about the honor of law enforcement, it all flows from the Ten Commandments, from the New Testament, from right versus wrong, good versus evil. And then I go into more specific about our founding fathers, about the Declaration of Independence, about the Constitution. And I personally believe that these documents were inspired by a higher power. I believe that wholeheartedly. So I don't have just a logical, position on this. I mean, when I say logical, a mental thing, because some people may think I'm illogical. What I'm saying is, it's not just a thought process. I also have a spiritual tie to the honor for law enforcement, because I think that enforcing the law, that people that go out there decide voluntarily, they get paid, but voluntarily decide to become law enforcement officers, are doing something that it should be honored. It's doing something to potentially sacrifice your life for your community, for your fellow man. And if that's not God-driven, I don't know what is. If that can't be seen as an honorable profession, I don't know what can. There are a lot of honorable professions out there, but being a law enforcement officer, especially today, it needs to be honored. It should be honored. And there's a reason for it. It's because I believe it's inspired by a greater power. And since I think that the Declaration and the Constitution are the two greatest cultural and government documents ever authored, and I think they are inspired by a higher power, it's law enforcement officers that really enforce those codified pieces of the Declaration, and of course, what's in the Constitution. So without law enforcement, we do not have a civil society. Period. End of story. And that's where I come from.
Mark, don't you know, haven't you gotten the memo that all of this is out of fashion?
It is out of fashion. You're right, which is a sad reflection on society and our culture right now. But I say this, Jarrett, whether it was the Revolutionary War, it was the Civil War, all the other things that we've been through in this country, if we can survive those and thrive after those very, very challenging times, we can win this battle. We can win this battle. Because, oh my God, we have, the woke culture. You're right. It's a disaster. We have this. We have the attack on the nuclear family. We have people that are not going to church anymore. But everybody that we look back on now and say, oh my God, those were great people. Those were great leaders. They were selfless. They were courageous. They all faced challenges that we think that we could not have met. Well, now it's our turn.
Yeah.
You can either say someone else did it, only they can do it, or damn it, you can say, I will step up. I will follow the leadership of those people that I admire. They went through it. My dad was 12, black, poor, deep South, depression, Jim Crow, no parents, and he succeeded. If he succeeded, then as a group, we can succeed and we can fight back and we can win this battle.
Yeah, that makes this a country worth fighting for, a country worth preserving.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, I can't possibly thank you enough. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm glad I got a chance to talk to you. I'd love to talk to you again. It's
really been my pleasure. It's been an honor. I mean that. And I'd love to come back on whenever you can put up with me once again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really resonate with what Mark is saying here. Someday a future generation is going to look back on us and say, wow, those folks really went through some tough times. The question then is, what did they say about how we responded to those tough times? Did we stand up under the pressure, or did we hand down a dumpster fire? Did we successfully communicate our values to the next generation, or did we leave them unprepared? You and I are being tested right now. Everything we do and everything we fail to do will leave an impact. And history will not be graded on a curve. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
Yeah, they were brutal murders, and of those 80 murders that happened within that year, the majority of them would be run-of-the-mill murders, stabbings, strangulation, etc. What we were seeing here was something new, and it went beyond the murder. It was then going into the mutilation of bodies, etc., which is something that people weren't used to. So one of them was bad enough, and when you've got 2, 3, 4, you can imagine that the hysteria, and they were happening within quite a short space of time from each other. So the first one was in August, and the last one was in November. The main ones, the one that the people really attribute to Jack the Ripper. So they're happening. The frequency of them, the veracity of them, the tight location, everything was generating this fear within this small part of London.
If you have stories, wisdom, and encouragement you'd like to share, please reach out to me. Specifically, if you know someone in law enforcement who is especially good at telling stories or has a particularly poignant story to tell, recommend them to me, and maybe we can work something out. My email is in the show notes, and you can find Hey Chaplain on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city. And hey, there's a bunch of you to whom I have sent Hey Chaplain stickers and magnets. If you're one of the people who've received those, then please send me a picture of what you've done with them. If you put that sticker on a water bottle or on your car, or you put that magnet on the refrigerator at the police station, send me a picture of that so I can share it with everybody.